Picture this, you're in an old Western saloon, those swinging doors, dusty streets, a piano playing in the corner.
Yeah.
But instead of a showdown at high noon, it's a group of men strolling into a bank,
Okay.
armed with canes and revolvers.
Interesting.
Now, this isn't some forgotten film plot. This is U.S. Marines in 1914, Haiti, pulling off what some call a government-sanctioned bank heist.
It's a striking image, and it really captures the kind of interventionist actions we'll be examining today.
Right, it might sound like something out of a Hollywood movie, but we're diving into a real and often overlooked chapter of U.S. history, Woodrow Wilson's interventions in Haiti and Mexico.
And we'll see how a president known for his idealism also took actions that had lasting consequences for U.S. relations with Latin America.
So let's rewind back to that Haitian bank heist.
Yeah.
What was going on that led to U.S. Marines disguised as civilians taking gold from Haiti's national bank and onto a U.S. warship?
Well, Haiti had been struggling for decades with financial instability, debt and political turmoil.
Oh, I see.
By 1910, a group of foreign banks, including the U.S.-based National City Bank, had a big stake in Haiti's central bank.
Okay.
They were worried about the Haitian government's potential plans to change its currency.
So the Marines swooped in to protect those U.S. financial interests?
Essentially, yes. You see, Roger Leslie Farnham, vice president of National City Bank, convinced U.S. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan that securing the gold was the right thing to do.
It's amazing how they called this removal of gold a withdrawal by the bank, while Haitians saw it as a straight-up theft.
Absolutely. And this act, regardless of how it was framed, it really highlighted the power dynamics at play, and it sowed those seeds of resentment that would grow in the years to come.
And this bank heist was just the beginning, right?
Right.
It escalated into a full-blown U.S. occupation of Haiti.
Sadly, yes. The assassination of Haitian President Vilbrun Guillaume Sam in 1915 created more chaos, and President Wilson used that unrest and the fear of German influence during World War I to justify sending in U.S. troops.
So under the guise of restoring order, the U.S. basically took control of Haiti.
Essentially, and we see a similar pattern in the Dominican Republic. Just a year later, in 1916, the U.S. occupied them using those same justifications of instability and potential German influence. This basically gave the U.S. control over the whole island of Hispaniola.
It's a stark example of how a nation's desire to protect its interests, financial or strategic, can lead to actions that infringe on the sovereignty of other nations.
It is, and these interventions were shaped by this belief in U.S. exceptionalism and the idea that the U.S. had a duty to guide less developed nations, that white man's burden concept.
That paternalistic attitude definitely complicates the narrative of U.S. intentions, even if they were framed as, benevolent at the time.
For sure. And it's so important to look at these historical events through the lens of power dynamics and the ideologies of that era.
These interventions in Haiti and the Dominican Republic set the stage for a recurring theme in U.S.-Latin American relations.
Yeah.
That cycle of intervention and resistance.
Right. And as we shift our focus to U.S. involvement in the Mexican Revolution, we'll see this play out in even more dramatic ways.
And speaking of the Mexican Revolution, it was a wild time, with figures like Pancho Villa emerging as both heroes and villains, depending on who you ask.
Exactly. Mexico in the early 20th century was like a powder keg ready to explode.
Wow.
Decades of rule under Porfirio Diaz, a dictator who favored the wealthy elite, had created a deeply divided society.
And this simmering discontent finally erupted in 1910. Tell us about the revolution that set the stage for U.S. involvement.
Yes, so in 1910, Francisco Madero, an advocate for democracy and social justice, challenged Diaz. This ignited a widespread revolution that quickly swept across the nation.
It must have been a shock to Diaz after all those years in power.
It was. He was forced into exile and Madero became president. But his victory was short-lived. A military coup in 1913, led by Victoriano Huerta, resulted in Madero's assassination and Huerta's seizing power.
And this is where Woodrow Wilson, with his moral diplomacy, enters the scene. He wasn't a fan of Huerta's methods, was he?
Not at all. Wilson, being a staunch idealist, was deeply troubled by Huerta's brutality and his illegitimate rise to power. He refused to recognize Huerta's regime, called him a butcher, and demanded democratic elections in Mexico.
That's a big change from the usual U.S. foreign policy of recognizing whoever's in power, no matter how they got there.
It was a significant shift, and it definitely caused some controversy. Wilson's moral diplomacy was a mix of idealism, some might say paternalism. He believed the U.S. had a moral obligation to promote democracy and oppose tyranny, but this approach also reflected a sense of U.S. superiority.
Right, that idea that the U.S. had the right to intervene in other nations' affairs.
Precisely. And this moral diplomacy led to some very real consequences. The Tampico affair comes to mind, a seemingly small incident that blew up into a major international crisis.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
So in 1914, some U.S. sailors were briefly detained in Tampico, a Mexican port city. It was really just a misunderstanding, but it became a big deal. The U.S. demanded a 21-gun salute as an apology, which Huerta refused to give unless the U.S. reciprocated, which would have meant recognizing his regime.
So a diplomatic standoff fueled by pride and political maneuvering.
Exactly. And it gave Wilson the reason he needed to take more drastic action. He used the Tampico affair as a pretext to order the U.S. occupation of Veracruz, another important Mexican port. The official goal was to prevent German weapons from reaching Huerta, but it was also a clear show of force.
So the U.S. occupies Veracruz, getting further entangled in the Mexican Revolution. But didn't this intervention also give a boost to Pancho Villa?
You're right. The Mexican Revolution was a complex and chaotic conflict with some fascinating characters. And Pancho Villa, a skilled military leader and a champion of the poor, but also at times a ruthless bandit, was one of the most prominent figures.
He's the one who embodies that Wild West image many people have of the Mexican Revolution. How did his rise connect with this growing U.S. involvement in Mexico?
Well, Villa initially supported Venustiano Carranza, another revolutionary leader, but they had a falling out. When the U.S. occupied Veracruz, Villa saw a chance to position himself as the true defender of Mexican sovereignty.
So he used anti-American sentiment to his advantage.
It's definitely a possible interpretation. He condemned Carranza as a puppet of the U.S. and launched his own campaign for control. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, Villa took the fight right to the U.S.
You're talking about the Columbus raid in 1916. Tell us about that.
In March of 1916, Pancho Villa led a daring raid on Columbus, New Mexico. He attacked a U.S. Army camp and a nearby town. This attack on U.S. soil, which killed American civilians, caused outrage and demands for retaliation.
What do historians think motivated Villa to attack the U.S.?
There are a few theories. Some believe he was getting revenge for U.S. support of Carranza, who had recently defeated Villa's forces. Others think he wanted to provoke a war between the U.S. and Mexico, believing it would unite Mexicans against a common enemy. And still others say he was just trying to get resources and weapons. It was probably a mix of all these factors.
And this attack on U.S. soil couldn't be ignored. What did Wilson do?
Wilson, facing intense public pressure to hit back, ordered General John J. Pershing, a seasoned military leader, to lead a punitive expedition into Mexico to capture Pancho Villa.
So thousands of U.S. troops went across the border to hunt down a Mexican revolutionary in his own territory. What a crazy situation. Did they ever catch him?
No, they didn't. Villa, a master of guerrilla warfare, was like a ghost. He knew the land had local support and was a brilliant tactician. Pershing's forces chased him for almost a year, but Villa always stayed one step ahead.
That must have been a humbling experience for the U.S. military. What did this punitive expedition achieve besides escalating tensions?
It definitely raised questions about how effective U.S. intervention could be. The mission was expensive in terms of both resources and lives, and failing to capture. Villa showed the limits of U.S. military power in this complex and volatile situation.
And all this is happening as World War I is raging in Europe, pulling the U.S. closer and closer to getting involved.
Exactly. By 1917, with the U.S. about to enter the war in Europe, Wilson realized he couldn't stay bogged down in Mexico. He ordered Pershing to withdraw, and the punitive expedition ended.
So the U.S. intervention in Mexico, much like in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, had unintended consequences and left a complicated legacy.
It did. Wilson's actions, while driven by his idea of moral diplomacy, ultimately fueled resentment, instability, and mistrust in the region. And it raises important questions about using military force to achieve foreign policy goals.
It's fascinating how these events unfolding as World War I loomed reveal a side of Woodrow Wilson that's often forgotten. He was a man of contradictions, a champion of democracy who wasn't afraid to intervene in other countries.
He was. And it reminds us that history is rarely simple. It's full of complexities, unintended consequences, and individuals grappling with tough choices.
We've covered a lot of ground. We've seen how U.S. intervention played out in both Haiti and Mexico, revealing a pattern of both idealism and self-interest shaping U.S. foreign policy. But what are the long-term effects of these interventions? How did they shape the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America?
Those are crucial questions, and they're ones we'll explore in our final segment.
Yeah, they did. They brought about some infrastructure improvements and financial reforms, but they also led to resentment resistance and the suppression of local political movements. And the punitive expedition into Mexico, which started because of the outrage over the Columbus raid, well, it didn't work out so well.
No, it didn't. It failed to capture Pancho Villa and just made the tension between the two countries worse.
These events really highlight the challenges of using military force to try and achieve complex foreign policy goals, especially in areas with such deep historical and cultural sensitivities.
That's true. And it's a lesson that seems relevant even today. We still see these complexities of intervention and the unintended consequences play out in global affairs.
Absolutely. Wilson's interventions, even though they were presented as trying to promote stability and democracy, they often backfired.
They did. And they reinforced those existing power imbalances and fueled this perception of the U.S. as an imperial power interfering in the affairs of its neighbors.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a bunch of facts and dates.
No, it's not.
It's a tapestry of choices, consequences, and the lasting impact of those actions, often with outcomes no one could have predicted.
And by thinking carefully about these historical events, we can gain a deeper understanding of how complicated our world is and hopefully make better decisions as we face the challenges of today.
Well said. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Woodrow Wilson's interventions in Haiti and Mexico. We encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating period of history, dig into the personal stories, and consider the many different perspectives that shape these events.
By continuing to explore and critically engage with the past, we can truly learn from history and maybe even chart a more just and equitable course for the future.
We've come a long way from those dusty streets of Port-au-Prince to the battlefields of the Mexican Revolution, uncovering a really complex and often forgotten part of U.S. history.
We have. And through these events, we've seen how Woodrow Wilson, a president praised for his idealism. He really wrestled with trying to balance his vision of a moral world order with the realities of power and national interest.
His moral diplomacy, even though it was presented as a new approach to foreign policy, it still ended up leading to interventions that raised those questions about U.S. motives and their long-term impact.
Right. It's important to remember these interventions didn't happen out of nowhere. The early 20th century was a time of huge global shifts, new ideologies emerging, the balance of power changing.
The U.S. was kind of finding its place on the world stage, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Figuring out how to handle its growing influence and maybe even the temptations of empire.
Exactly. And Wilson's interventions in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico show that struggle. He truly believed in democracy and self-determination, but he also had the strong belief in U.S. exceptionalism, that the U.S. had this special duty to guide and sometimes even control other nations.
It's a tough legacy to grapple with, full of contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
These interventions, even though they were supposed to bring stability and democracy, they often had the opposite effect.
Yeah.
The U.S. occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
They brought some improvements like infrastructure and financial reforms, but they also created resentment resistance and even suppressed local political movements.
That's right. And the punitive expedition into Mexico, it was fueled by public anger over the Columbus raid, but it ultimately failed to capture Pancho Villa and just made the tensions between the two countries worse.
These events really show us how difficult it is to use military force to achieve those complex foreign policy goals, especially in regions with deep historical and cultural sensitivities.
You're absolutely right, and it's something we still see today. The interventions of the early 20th century are like a warning, reminding us how important it is to understand history, culture, and power dynamics when dealing with other nations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this era, what are the key takeaways? What's the lasting impact of Woodrow Wilson's interventions in Latin America?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that U.S. actions in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico, they created a legacy of mistrust and resentment that has shaped U.S. Latin American relations for over a century.
Even with good intentions, these interventions made the power imbalances worse and fueled this view of the U.S. as an imperial power interfering in its neighbors' affairs.
Exactly. And those feelings still influence debates about U.S. foreign policy in the region today.
It also shows us how hard it is to balance idealism with pragmatism in international relations. Wilson's moral diplomacy was based on noble ideas, but it showed that good intentions alone aren't enough to guarantee good outcomes.
That's a really important point. It shows how crucial it is to understand the historical context, the cultural sensitivities, and the potential for things to go wrong when a country, even one with good intentions, decides to intervene in another country's affairs.
It reminds us that history is more than just facts and dates. It's about choices and consequences and the ripple effects of actions that often have unexpected outcomes.
And it's by thinking deeply about these historical events that we can learn and maybe make better decisions as we face the challenges of today.
Well said. And that concludes our deep dive into Woodrow Wilson's interventions in Haiti and Mexico. We hope this has sparked your curiosity, and we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating period of history, to learn more about the people involved, and to consider all the different perspectives that shaped these events. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.